So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Frank Wolak, who is currently professor of economics at Stanford University. He's been there for 25 years. He doesn't want me to tell you this, but his bachelor's degree was in economics from Rice, and his PhD in economics from Harvard. And he also doesn't want me to tell you, but I'm going to anyway, that he started out as an engineer and then saw the light of some sort and became an economist. But I think it provides then from the short time that I have talked to him, I was really pleased to see his tremendous interest in working with engineers, and I think it's a great appreciation for what engineers are trying to do in terms of moving us onto a sustainable path. He heads a center at Stanford, the title of which is the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development in the Freeman Spogli, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Institute for International Studies. We're delighted that you're here and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the introduction and humiliation. At least it'll comes at the start of the talk. I hope that's the... So how do I turn this on? With that, I guess I thought a little preview would be to say I sort of had two choices. One was to give you a sort of research paper, go into the details. I thought since this was sort of a interdisciplinary seminar, a better thing to do is give you more of a high-level survey of a bunch of work that I've done over the years. And so that's the first one. The second point is that the big thing, at least, that has gotten economists, and certainly me, extremely excited about the electricity industry is the fact that what we've done is essentially introduced market mechanisms to replace effectively vertically integrated, regulated utility market structures. And tying into the title of the talk is essentially how we design these market mechanisms has an enormous impact on, if you like, the benefits that consumers get from the technology that is embedded in the physical network. And so this just shows you basically everywhere where a whole bunch of people live, except is where we have introduced the market mechanisms. It's except for in the South and in the Western U.S. Another way to think about it is that every place that there are very high prices of electricity, we also have introduced the market mechanisms. And so what do we mean by restructuring, and the important point is to remember is that it is not the same thing as deregulation. In particular, for the lawyers or at least political scientists in the audience, electricity, believe it or not, is still regulated at both the wholesale and retail level in all of the states of the United States. It's just that in language that only I think a lawyer could understand, the regulated price is determined by market mechanisms. And so, if that makes any sense. So that's what we mean by restructuring, is we're going to replace, where we think it's possible, a explicit regulatory process with a market mechanism, and in particular have open access to transmission and open access to the distribution grid. We can do that at both the wholesale and retail level in allowing folks to compete to supply electricity. And what this does is that we're going to need regulation, but we're just limiting where the scope of regulation is going to take place. In particular, we're going to limit to just the network. So we're going to say, all right, for those of you who own the network, you're going to still get that regulated rate of return. You're just going to allow every generator to inject any place that they're located, and you're going to allow consumers, retailers in particular, large consumers, to withdraw any place they're located. We're guaranteeing that you're going to at least recover the cost of your network from prudent operation. If we had competition among network owners, we'd have this sort of problem that the fact that the sunk cost to build the network is very large, and we could have competition among network providers that would eventually drive network owners out of business. And so what we're going to do instead is just say one network will regulate that network. Interestingly enough, in the early days of electricity, for those of you who have ever seen the old pictures in like New York and other places, there were actually competing electric distribution networks, but eventually it was sort of decided to just stick with for exactly one for exactly this reason. So what was the historical structure of the industry? The historical structure said, look, because of this nature of monopoly aspects, in particular the monopoly aspect of the grid, as well as the fact that we think perhaps the economies to scale are so great for a given geographic area, we're going to have a vertically integrated monopoly market structure. What we mean by that is that one company is going to produce the electrons, going to transmit the electrons, going to distribute the network electrons, and then charge people for what they consume. And that's pretty much what the industry looked like for almost the first 100 years until a number of countries in the world, the UK is one, Chile was another one that introduced early on competitive markets for wholesale power. And this led to a regulatory process in the old regime that was pretty much lawyer and accountant intensive, in the sense that the accountants would help us to add up the numbers, the lawyers would check to see whether they did it right, as well as essentially determine whether or not how the numbers got added up were consistent with due process, and how prices got determined were consistent with that. What happens with the wholesale market regime is that it essentially it changes considerably, and as I wrote down here, it changes to a world in which what we're not after is going through a regulatory process to set a just and reasonable price, but we're going through a regulatory process that implements market rules, mechanisms for compensating people for the actions that they take that result in just and reasonable prices. So a certainly massively complex task, and I think far more complex task than I think even the most egotistical economist at first thought was possible, in the sense that if you like, electricity, as I'll show in a second, is essentially, there's a good reason this industry was regulated for at least 100 years. And so what we have is essentially regulation becomes, in the language of economists, very much like designing market rules, in the sense that what we come up with is on the next slide here, is when we restructure an industry, typically what we're going to do, step one, is we're going to say, all right, we need to sell off the assets of the vertically integrated utility, and how should we divide up those assets? So, for example, the typical restructuring process takes place where, say in the case of a country that has a state-owned electricity supply industry, is the government will say, okay, we're going to divide up these assets into various portfolios, and we're going to auction them off to the various participants to create a competitive market for the supply of electricity. So that's step one. Step two is we're going to figure out a way to essentially translate the revenues that these guys receive for the products that they supply. So in other words, how in the language of economics would we organize the auction mechanism to essentially allow suppliers to offer in the product that they have, and essentially determine the prices, or more generally the revenues they're going to receive. Now, the important part, and where the fun for economists come in, is the fact that we recognize in designing this market that that market participants are like teenagers, in that once you set the market rules, they are going to optimize against it. And that is the real challenge of market design. Is the fact that you as the market designer are trying to figure out a set of incentive structures so that what happens is that the if you like, the agents acting in their best interest yield market outcomes that are consistent with you, the market designer, want. And that is an immensely challenging task, to say the least. And, like all things in economics, it all goes back to Adam Smith. Except what Adam Smith was talking about about was a market that's not electricity, and not electricity in the following sense. It's not electricity in the sense that he was thinking in terms of atomistic firms, atomistic consumers, but in electricity, the firms are far from atomistic, and therein lies the real challenge, or at least one of the many challenges. And just let me skip that for a sec, but here is essentially the challenges that we face in electricity, is that if you said as an economist, you asked me, okay, what are the things that are going to make a competitive market difficult to manage? I'd say the first would be, okay, demand's got to equal supply to every instant in time. That's going to be really hard because it's got to be a just-in-time market. The next one I'd say is essentially you want to make sure that the product's not storable. Why do I want the product not to be storable? If it's not storable, someone can't take it and then store it and sell it later when someone else tries to raise the price. The other is I'd really like the fact that production is subject to capacity constraints. Why do I like the fact that production is subject to capacity constraints? It's because if I try to raise my price that I sell at, if I know that you're subject to capacity constraints, I know there's only a certain amount of the market that I'm going to lose in response to your action to raise the price. So that's a wonderful thing for me in terms of designing a market difficult. The other is that I'd like how it's priced to the ultimate consumer to be such that it creates a very inelastic demand. In other words, a demand that does not go away in response to a very high wholesale price. And then finally, the thing that I'd really like is it's got to be delivered through a specialized network. Why delivered through a specialized network? Well, so that no one can essentially arbitrage the fact that the price that I'm charging at my location with delivery through an alternate network. And so you think about that and you go, wait, that's basically electricity. So in terms of the language of economists is this is a market that is extremely susceptible to what economists like to call the exercise of unilateral market power, which essentially means the divergence between what we would like this market participant to do as a society and what this market participant finds in their unilateral interest. And that is the core sort of challenge of designing these markets, is that we sort of set it up to fail in the sense that the technological characteristics and in some sense the history of how we've priced this product makes it such that it is extremely difficult to get a very competitive market outcome. Okay, so the final point that I want to say on this issue of unilateral market power is there's nothing wrong under U.S. antitrust law with exercising unilateral market power. In fact, it's the equivalent of maximizing profits. It's if you like, it's what makes Adam Smith's market design point work. That in other words, as he says right here, is it says that, look, if the market is competitive, then essentially it is going to be in the interest of the butcher, the brewer, et cetera, to provide the product that we want, because if he doesn't provide the product that we want, someone else will, and therefore serving our interest is in his interest, but that only works if there's, if you like, a number of ready suppliers there. But if you think in terms of electricity, another one is entry. Entry is extremely hard in electricity. It's not like you can set up a plant today and produce large amounts of output. You've got to wait quite a bit of time to site your plant, to bring it online, to build it, et cetera. So again, another challenge of a restructured market. But the point that I want to make is on this is just simply that maximizing profits, exercising all available unilateral market power, meaning doing the best I can subject to the actions of my competitors, is the same thing as essentially maximizing profits, which is the same thing that we buy shares of stocks and firms for, which is serving their fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. And the other is just that market power is like gravity. It is essentially a force that influences outcomes in all wholesale or monetary markets, and just like the airplane, it's essentially a force that we need to manage to fly the airplane. It's the same thing, it's a force that we need to manage to essentially make market mechanisms for electricity serve the best interests of consumers, yet maintain the industry's long-term financial viability. So the first question that we then in terms of research is really understanding how firms do this in wholesale electricity markets. In other words, what are the things that enable firms to raise prices significantly? And so that's kind of the first thing I want to discuss in terms of thinking about the work that's done. Since the first step in thinking through how we're going to design the market is understanding how firms will optimize against any market design that we might put in place. Okay? And so the first step in understanding how to do that is, what are the, if you like, in the language of economics, what is the strategy space that is available to firms to exercise market power? Meaning, what are the things that they submit to the wholesale market operator to essentially influence the price that they are paid, as well as determine the quantities that they sell of electricity? Well, it's their offer curve. And what you do in wholesale markets is you submit essentially a function that depends upon your price. And it goes, this function is defined on the set P min to P max, meaning that it is at the offer floor. Most markets have an offer floor, the lowest possible offer price you can submit at, and they have an offer cap, the highest possible price, and then you essentially just submit, if you like, an increasing in all the markets, they're step functions, but it's essentially an increasing step function of your willingness to supply electricity from your generation units as a function of the market price. Now, the important point in electricity markets that makes it a wonderful place for economists is that, different from other markets, we actually get to observe these offer curves. And this is different from any other markets you could think of. In other words, I just wrote down a few examples: cars, air travel, labor. In other words, I don't know GM's willingness to supply a given car as a function of the price that they are able to sell for that car. I only know the price that GM is selling that car at. But in this case, I know essentially the willingness to supply of this firm for every price level that could possibly exist in the market. And if you believe that firms maximize profits, that conveys a lot of information about the firm. And that's essentially what I want to show you in the following, and has some first testable implications, as well as is going to allow us to recover things about this firm that are not directly observable, but essentially are implied by its, if you like, profit maximizing behavior. So what we'll define is this object that is called a residual demand curve. And it is essentially the market demand minus the aggregate willingness to supply of everybody else. So for example, if I want to get mathematically the residual demand that firm 1 faces, it's the demand from the market less the willingness to supply everybody else. Now again, the nice thing is in the context of electricity markets, this is actually ex post observable. In other words, they submit, the demanders submit their willingness to purchase, each supplier submits his offer curve, and so I can compute what that firm's residual demand curve is. So this just goes through, this is using actual data from the wholesale market, in particular, in this case it's the market in New Zealand, so this is the market demand, this is the aggregate willingness to supply of everybody else but this firm that I'm interested, firm A, and then all you do is you just take the difference at each price between what everybody else's willingness to supply and the market demand, and the idea is what is left over to be, if you like, supplied by me, and that is the residual demand curve that I face. Now, the nice thing is that given that residual demand curve, what do I want to do? Well, what I want to do is I want to maximize profits off of my residual demand curve. So if I am a profit maximizing supplier, this would be my profits. It's just what is the residual demand I face at that price times the price I charge. What is my cost of producing that level of output? And then we can just use pretty simple graphical analysis to say, okay, I really want to behave like a monopolist off of my residual demand curve. What I'd like to do is essentially charge this price, this quantity. Now, the trouble with this is exactly the right way to think about the problem. And the first point that I just want to show you is that the flatter the residual demand curve that I face, what you can see is the closer is the difference between the price that I want to set in the market and the marginal cost of producing that level of output here, until what you can see is eventually, if the competitive response of my competitors, meaning think of it as the willingness to supply of them, is so price responsive that what can happen is it can be unilateral profit maximizing for me to essentially produce at the point that price equal marginal cost. But the important point to notice is that is never unilaterally profit maximizing for me if I face an upward sloping residual demand, meaning that if my competitors are submitting upward sloping offer curves, right? And so what that's going to give me is always an upward sloping residual demand curve. It's always going to give me a unilateral incentive to essentially withhold output to drive the price up. And that's the thing that we'd like to eliminate, because that is essentially going to. So if the world was that simple, we'd sort of be done right here. But the problem is that I don't know what residual demands I'm going to face, because, right, I don't know what the offers of my competitors are until they submit them. That's why I said is that it's only ex post known. But the good news is that these markets take place every single day. Days look pretty similar. Moreover, I can just hire somebody from the other firm and get a pretty good idea, or as is also the case, is that there's a considerable amount of intelligence that goes on, as well as often the bids are released in a number of these markets. So you get a pretty good idea of what the distribution of residual demands is. And then all I do is I say, okay, the residual demand could either be this or it could be this. Okay, and then what I do is simply say, okay, if it's this, then I'd like to produce right here. And if the residual demand is this, then I'd go through the same argument, I'd like to produce here. So the offer curve that I'm going to submit, if this is the residual demand curve I face, it's just going to pass through these 2 points. So, and now we're getting closer to sort of the way to think about how firms are going to want to maximize profits, is they're going to essentially say, I look at the distribution of residual demand curves that I face, and then what I want to do is submit an offer curve that essentially passes through those residual demand curves to create market clearing prices and quantity pairs such that I maximize my expected profits. Now, the thing you can see is, again, offer curves, just to continue our diagram, you can see that when I face a distribution of steep residual demand curves, my offer curve differs significantly from my marginal cost. But as the offer curves get flatter until finally completely flat, you can see that there I want to submit an offer curve that is equal to my marginal cost curve. So now you've got sort of, what is the market design process then? The market design process is essentially, in summary, very simple terms, is to say, how do I make the distribution of residual demand curves that suppliers face as flat as possible? Because if I make them flat, then each supplier is going to find it in his unilateral incentive to submit an offer curve that is equal to his marginal cost curve, which is then going to mean that we get a market clearing price that's very close to the, if you like, the perfectly competitive ideal that we'd like to see. So how do we do that? These are sort of the 4 dimensions of how we do that I'm going to sort of take you through to say how each one of these things. So what are factors that we want to think of when we're designing a competitive wholesale market to give it the best chance for success? Think of it as, once we've determined what is the market structure, meaning how many firms and who owns how much capacity, these are factors, if you like, that we can then think of as adjusting to try to ensure that that the market is going to work as well as possible. So, but the first step is I took you through this example and showed you how firms maximize profits. The first step you might think is, well, that's all fine and good, but do firms really behave this way? Do they really understand this residual demand concept? And do they really understand that they're bidding against this distribution of residual demand curves? Or in the language of economists, do firms really maximize expected profits? So another area of research is to say, okay, we've developed a model of expected profit maximizing behavior. It's a bit more complicated as to how it's actually implemented in this paper, but the idea is that the way we implement it in the paper is we recognize that firms actually do bid step functions. And so what they face are step functions to residual demand curves. And so the nice sort of calculus approach that I showed you doesn't work, meaning that but the nice thing is we get a set of, if you like, first order conditions that give rise to effectively what we get are essentially big, huge, multivariate vectors of realized what we'll call first order conditions that are essentially should have an expected value equal to 0. So what we can do is we can say, look, if you really are maximizing expected profits, then if I take your actual offer curves, the residual demand curves that you actually face, the residual demand curve realizations you actually face, what I should get is a random vector, then averaged across all days, that should be equal to 0 in expectation. And so what I can then do is really get, in the language of economics, just a non-parametric test of expected profit maximizing behavior. And the nice thing is because remember, all of the stuff that I need to know is actually observed by me because I observe all the offers, I observe the level of output, I therefore observe the residual demands that you submitted. And what I can do is essentially provide a test of this assumption. And sure enough, in the case of for the Australian market, it performed this test, and you certainly find little evidence against it. Again, for a similar case in New Zealand, as well in Colombia, same sort of thing. In all these markets, suppliers essentially submit curves that look like this. So what you could think of is we're going to get a first order condition that says you pick this price such that in expectations some random function of the offer curves and the like equals 0. You pick this price, so such random function of the offers equals 0, and so on for all the prices. And in particular, for the suppliers, you'll often get something like they're picking, maybe 60 or 70 offer prices, typically because they get to submit for each generation unit they own, say 10 bid steps, and they have, say, 7 or 8 generation units. So you get this big, large vector that should be equal to 0 in expectation that you can test that hypothesis. So this sort of model has then been used in a number of other papers, in particular that have investigated similar sorts of things in terms of how firms behave in these markets. And the nice thing is as you said, is that from this we get this kind of, if you like, test of whether or not do firms really recognize that they're bidding against this distribution of residual demand curves. The best thing I can say from the available evidence is there certainly is no statistically significant evidence against that null hypothesis. So in other words, I can't tell you that for sure they're doing that, but I can say that the data at least provides little evidence against that. Okay, so the idea I just wanted to say here is that the difficulty here is what you're doing in the case of step functions is that you now have this point that, as you saw, when we went back here, it's more of perhaps a bit of a technical point, is you saw the sort of probability of this event versus the probability of that event in terms of the residual demand curve realizations did not impact the offer curve I submit. Whereas in the case of step function residual demand curves, you got to worry about that the probability that, in other words, the market rules can bind. So what I've done is I've said you could have the case that for this residual demand curve, this level of output is the expected profit, as the realized profit maximizing level of output. That for this residual demand curve, this is the realized realized profit maximizing level of output, and so on for that one. But the problem is the market rules prohibit you from submitting a step function that passes through those 3 points because the rules require you to submit upward sloping or increasing step functions. So the probabilities of these events matter, and it makes testing a bit more complicated. But I save you all the technical details and just tell you that there's very little evidence. So then the next thing that we can do off of this is we can say, okay, I've at least hopefully in some sense convinced you not to be too skeptical that firms recognize how to submit offers against this distribution of residual demand curves. Now the next thing we want to do is essentially get some measures of what types of market conditions might lead to a greater ability of firms to exercise market power based on this. And the simplest one you can immediately see pops out is that, look, when the residual demand curves look like this, very little opportunities to exercise market power. Withholding doesn't increase the price very much. When residual demand curves look like that, very good opportunities. And so the first place we sort of tried this out was in the California market. So what do? We took essentially all the hours in the summer of 1998 and through 2000, and for each of the 5 suppliers in California, the 5 large thermal suppliers, we computed for each hour of the day, what did their residual demand curve look like? And we came up with a summary measure, which economists like, which is essentially, think of it as the elasticity, or in this case, the inverse elasticity, so think of it as the how much do I percent increase in price for a sort of X% increase in quantity. And so we computed this, and we found that essentially that measure of, for a given percentage reduction in the quantity, how much did that percentage increase the price? And in 1998 and 1999, we found essentially that very little. But in other words, for those 5 suppliers during this period, the residual demand curves that they faced were quite flat. However, for 2000, much higher, orders of magnitude higher. In other words, in many cases, orders of magnitude 10 times higher in summer 2000 versus the summer of 1998, 1999. So the first question you might ask yourself is, wait, I thought I remembered what happened in California in summer 2000. And so the first thing this should probably point to is to say, okay, perhaps one of the reasons why what happened in California was the result of the fact that suppliers had a significant increase in their ability to exercise unilateral market power, and that certainly is consistent with that. Now, as I said, most of these sorts of measures of thinking about how to exercise market power, as you might imagine, are very interested parties are market monitors in the various U.S. markets and regulators, and these sorts of methods are fairly standard now around the world in terms of how people think about measuring this. Then the other area that we looked at related to this is to say, okay, how much is this sort of unilateral behavior of suppliers, how much is this, if you like, costing consumers? So the simple way to think about it is that we want to compare actual market outcomes to market outcomes that would exist if no firm had the ability to exercise market power, meaning that if firms bid as if they had no ability to influence the market price. And what we did is we looked at this for 1998 to 2000 again, and what we found was extreme differences between actual prices and this competitive benchmark price in 2000 versus very little difference between 1998 and 1999. So what this gives us is sort of cohesive story that says, look, when the unilateral ability of suppliers to exercise market power is very great, the resulting market outcomes are consistent with the fact that you actually see prices substantially above what they would be if firms had no ability to exercise market power. And again, these measures have been adopted in the various by the various regulators that look at measuring market performance. So the idea is as we said, is also being used. For those of you who may have been following in the newspaper, there was a recent decision out of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to order refunds to California because the prices that were charged during the 2000 period were deemed to be not just unreasonable prices, and the federal law requires FERC to issue refunds. Those refunds were based on this approach. And so now what I want to turn to is to say, okay, now I've hopefully at least convinced you that that firms recognize how to exercise unilateral market power, the factors that contribute to their ability to exercise market power, the cost of the exercise of market power, and how we might measure it. Now the next question is, how do we limit it? And so the first one is forward contracts, what we'll call as fixed price forward contracts. So here, these are essentially the simplest way to describe what a forward contract is it is an agreement between a buyer of power and a seller of essentially the price and quantity at which they're going to transact. So what this means is, as I said right here, if I agree to deliver, and we put deliver in quotes, I deliver 100 megawatt hours at $50, then what that really simply means, since you can't deliver electrons, that violates the sort of laws of physics, is it agrees that you have the right buyer to purchase 100 megawatts at the agreed upon price. So the way that works in terms of settling is we have these difference payments. So the way it would work is you buyer, me seller, we both continue to buy the power we consume out of the short-term market at the short-term price, but then we make these difference payments to each other. So for example, if the realized short-term price is down here, then what's going to happen is that, think of it as the buyer of the contract is the retailer and the generator is the seller of the contract. Then in this case, what's going to happen is the retailer got to buy at this price, but he signed a forward contract to buy at the contract price. So what he does is he makes this payment right here, this blue payment right here, to the generator, because the generator sold at this price too, but the forward contract guaranteed that the generator could sell QC at a price PC, so retailer makes difference payment to generator of this amount. And equivalently, if the short-term price is PM2, then the difference payment goes the other way, in that generator has to pay the red area to the retailer, because the retailer bought at PM2 everything he consumed, but the generator guaranteed that the retailer could buy at PC, QC, so he's got to make the red payment to the retailer. So that's why they're called difference payments. But the first thing you can see is, wait a minute, the existence of these difference payments may change the incentives of suppliers. And that's the point that I want to show you. So the first thing to see is, all I did was just write this out mathematically. I said, okay, the first one is kind of what I told you, which is, this is how much I sold in the short-term market. This is the price I received minus my marginal cost. I just made it constant to make it simple. And then here, these are the difference payments. So if the price is above PC, then I, the generator, make that payment to the retailer. So I lose P minus PC if P minus PC is positive. If it's the other way around, then I get P minus PC. Or another way you can think about it, and just rearranging things, is you can say, what I do is I get essentially this right here, all right, is money in the bank. I sold it at a forward contract price at marginal cost C for QC. That's money in the bank. And then what happens is I effectively get to sell the difference between what I sell in the spot market and my forward contract. That is essentially, again, at price minus marginal cost. Now, the neat thing to see is if I expect to sell less in the short-term market than my forward contract position, that's negative, which means then I want to drive the price down below my marginal cost. I want negative marginal cost. So that's just to show you one thing to say that it changes, if this is going to change the supplier's incentive in the short-term market. And a simple way to see this is to say we can rewrite this like this, which says residual demand curve net of forward contracts, all right, times price minus marginal cost plus the fixed cost. And the nice thing about that is by the fixed cost we mean that the forward contract's been negotiated in advance, and that's just a payment stream. The only thing that I affect by my bidding behavior is the short-term price. And so we can use the same diagram, but we use it a little bit different in the following sense. So here's the residual demand curve that I face. Here is my residual demand curve net of forward contracts. If what we do is we say, all right, let's look at the intersection of the marginal revenue curve with respect to no contracts with the firm's marginal cost curve, that's what he'd want to produce if he had no contracts. That's the price he'd want to set. Now with forward contracts, we go through the exact same process. We say, where is the intersection of the marginal revenue curve net of forward contracts with the marginal cost curve? It's right there. He wants to produce short-term production minus contract quantity is this right here, but his contract total output is right here. And what we can see is he now has, for the same amount of competition from his other suppliers, meaning the same residual demand curve, he now wants to supply more at a lower price. So what we can see is that, that the forward contracts now, if we take this logic through, we can go all the way to here. And what I've done here, just to show you, is I've said, let's take the same two residual demand curve realizations and draw that same diagram we drew before with respect to connecting the dots. And this is just an intuitive way to illustrate a more general theoretical result, is what you can see is this is the willingness to supply curve that he would find expected profit maximizing if he had no contracts. This is the willingness to supply curve that he would find unilateral profit maximizing he had contracts. And the thing you can see is he wants to supply unilaterally more output at every price. And so what we're going to get is the existence of forward contracts makes me a more aggressive player in the short-term market. Okay, so which does what, if we think about it, is it says to my competitor, if I know that you have if you know that I have forward contracts, you know I will behave more aggressively in the short-term market. My more aggressive behavior in the short-term market is going to leave you with a flatter distribution of residual demand curves, which then is going to make it you have a less of an ability to exercise market power, which means that you're going to probably be more likely to want to sign forward contracts, and therefore we're going to get this wonderful virtuous cycle. And the important thing for those of you who may have followed at all what happened in California, you may have heard something about the fact that there were no forward contracts that were held by the generators in California, so they had a unilateral incentive to essentially raise the short-term price with every unit they sold, and even better, all their competitors knew that they had a unilateral incentive to raise the short-term price with every unit of output they sold, so it became a wonderful place to submit very steep offer curves, whereas with a high level of fixed price forward contracting, you get this virtuous cycle working of I submit a flatter offer curve closer to my marginal cost, which causes you to submit a flatter offer curve, which causes me to submit a flatter offer curve, and so on. Okay, so the next question to ask is, okay, I've sort of showed you what the existence of forward contracts do to the unilateral ability of supplier, or incentive rather, of suppliers to raise the short-term price to submit offers. So the first question is usually what happens in most restructuring processes is, step one is we're going to restructure and sell off the generation assets with a forward contract attached. Meaning that if you have a 500 megawatt unit, I'm going to say, look, associated with that unit is a forward contract that, say, obligates you to supply, say, 400 megawatts 24/7 at this fixed price. So then what it does is creates this incentive for you to put that energy into the short-term market rather than withhold it to drive the price up. Now, there's another reason why firms may want to sign forward contracts. As we said, the first is to manage short-term price risk. In a number, for example, in a hydro-dominated system, if it all of a sudden rains a whole lot, what can happen is that the price can be very low for a very long time. So I, as a generator, may have an incentive to sign a forward contract at a sort of, if you like, the expected water level price. And that's the thing that give me as a supplier an incentive to do. The other is this fear that we discussed in the sense of if I know my competitor has a high level of forward contracts, then I know that I better have forward contracts too, because I know he's going to be a very aggressive competitor in the short-term market, leaving me with a very flat residual demand curve distribution, meaning that I am going to therefore have to, I'm not going to be able to raise price very much, so I might as well sign forward contracts to commit myself to a very aggressive behavior if I can get a decent forward contract price. There's a last sort of issue, which is kind of, I think, is an interesting one as well, is that it also commits the supplier to essentially producing, in a, if you like, a lower cost pattern of output. Because what signing a forward contract does is makes me less responsive to the distribution of residual demand curves that I face. So for example, if it's very steep, I withhold to drive up a lot. If it's then less steep, then I withhold little. So I'm going to push my unit around a lot. And so, this just shows you kind of a simple illustration of the point, is that most generation units are kind of like freight trains, in the sense that once you get them going, you want to keep them sort of where they're operating at. Moving them around a lot is like accelerating the car, putting on the brakes, and it can get very expensive. So if we think of it as, look, this is the marginal cost of producing each level of output, and there is some sweet spot for my generation unit, then if what I did is I signed a forward contract that essentially was very close to this Q min, then I would have an incentive to produce a very smooth pattern of output. And what I'm just showing is that without contracts, I may have a pattern of output that might look like that. In other words, it probably more closely follows the pattern of load throughout the day. And so then what I've done is I said, okay, for this pattern of output, what would the pattern of marginal cost look like for each level of output? It looks something like that. Whereas for that pattern of output, the marginal cost for all of the time periods in the day would simply be the marginal cost associated with Q minimum. So you can see that what I do is I'm committing myself to a lower cost pattern of output by signing this forward contract. And so one of the things we look at is you can use the model of expected profit maximizing behavior. And you can say, okay, if I believe that firms maximize expected profits, I can then essentially recover what must have been their cost of production in each hour of that day. And I can ask the question of, suppose that I change the level of contracting for that cost function, how much more volatile would their pattern of output be? How much more costly would their pattern of output be? And what we found was for a large thermal supplier that we expect these costs to be non-trivial. We found first that yes, there is evidence that they exist, as well as that essentially signing these contracts can help to reduce the daily cost of production for these firms in the neighborhood of about, say, 5 to 10%. So a non-trivial benefit to the firm from signing these forward contracts. So the argument being is that, okay, these firms have a benefit to the firm that undertakes them in terms of reducing the cost of producing the output that they produce, because committing them to a fairly smooth pattern of output. But moreover, it has the benefit of making the market more competitive to achieve prices closer to what we'd like to see. So the next area is the area of transmission. So the important point about transmission is its role changes dramatically in the restructuring market versus the vertically integrated market. And the simple way is to say it's going to improve the performance of an imperfectly regulated vertically integrated utility versus improving the performance of an imperfectly competitive wholesale market. And what's the difference? The difference is, in the case of the vertically integrated utility, remember, it owns all the generation units. So what it's going to do is it knows the cost of everything that it's producing, whereas under the wholesale market, firms are going to say, wow, the configuration of the transmission network, that's just another thing I optimize against. Okay, and if I think that what I can do is withhold output, congest the network, segment my market, that enables me to increase the price at which I sell, that's a good thing. So that can be unilaterally profit maximizing for me to do. And so what transmission can do is it can, as I wrote here, is it can increase the number of hours a year that I face competition. So let me just give you a simple example. So here again, I'm drawing up this residual demand curve, and I'm drawing it up for, we've got offer curve of firm 2, offer curve of firm 3. This is essentially the residual demand curve that firm 1 faces. So think of it as it's this, if you like, plus this, subtracted off of this, and that gives you this line right here. And what you can see is if we have transmission constraints, meaning that the offers of this firm can't get in past this location because of the configuration of the transmission network. You can see it steepens up the residual demand curve that the firm faces. By steepening up that curve, we're giving that firm greater opportunities to essentially exploit its favorable position. So by upgrading the transmission network, we flatten it out. We're going to get that firm to behave more aggressively. So the idea is that, as I said, is that by precluding these offers, we can see that one benefit of transmission is that essentially, again, just makes the distribution of residual demand curves that suppliers face flatter. So one question we might ask is to say, okay, how big is that effect? Is it something that we should worry about? Is it something that we should try to incorporate into transmission planning processes? Because remember, transmission is not built based on, market prices. It is an essentially regulated entity, and there is a transmission planning process. There's typically a cost-benefit calculation. This is a potential source of benefits to the transmission expansion that it becomes relevant in the wholesale market regime. So as we said, we call this the competitiveness benefits of transmission expansion, because what it says is, okay, as a result of this expansion, I'm going to get firms to behave more aggressively, to offer closer to their cost, and hopefully what kind of impact does that have on the market clearing price. So what we do is the nice thing is we do this for the Alberta market. Why the Alberta market? Well, two reasons. First, it's a pretty simple and small market, so it's a great place to look at this. The other is, essentially, it has some pretty steep offer curves, meaning that suppliers recognize that when transmission congestion exists, they can raise prices quite a bit. So it sort of is a nice test place to look at this. So what we do is we use the model of expected profit maximizing behavior that we discussed before. We say, okay, let's look at the circumstance with the upgrade, and then let's ask, how would this firm change its offers in response to the fact that this upgrade takes place? We then say, how much do his offers change? Then we rerun what the market price would be with those revised offers, and we get a price difference between what was the actual price and what was the price that would have been had the market had more transmission at this location. And that difference times the amount of energy that's actually purchased at that price gives us essentially the so-called consumer competitiveness benefits. In other words, how much lower do consumers have to pay for electricity as a result of this upgrade? And what we find is essentially that these are certainly fairly sizable and a significant fraction of the cost of these transmission. It could cause significantly more transmission to be built than is actually being built if these benefit sources were included. The other is that we also looked at is Alberta has a non-trivial amount of wind energy. And so one of the things we looked at is, since we have hourly measures of this competitiveness benefit, we said, okay, what does it look like in terms of hours when there's very little wind versus hours when there's a lot of wind? And one of the things that you imagine is, look, if I am a thermal generator and I know that the wind has disappeared, I'm certainly going to take advantage of that fact in terms of the offers that I submit. And so one of the things we can immediately see is it shows up that during those hours with low wind, you certainly get a larger benefit to expanding the transmission network, which then says that in a market where we're going to try to scale the extent of renewables, accounting for this source of benefits is certainly something that becomes even more important. And so the idea here is we're currently trying to extend this methodology to more complex markets, in particular markets with more spatially diffuse pricing. So for example, zonal pricing markets as well as nodal pricing markets. And the idea is to try to actually get this stuff implemented in actual regulatory processes. There seems to be a lot of interest and recognition of this source of benefits, but the difficult problem is sort of making sure that it actually gets it can be done in a manner that's transparent, easy for people to understand, and so that's the. But certainly there is a desire to try to implement this source of benefits. So the next one is what I'll call is symmetric treatment of load and generation. So here the simple idea is consumers are suppliers of megawatts in the sense that if you are a consumer that's paying the hourly price, you essentially supply megawatts, meaning your demand at a price of 0 minus your demand at a price of P, and you're an upward sloping offer curve. But you're an offer curve that actually wants to reduce the price of purchasing power. And so the simple way to see this graphically is just the fact that we get this upward sloping demand curve creates a flatter residual demand curve for the firm than would be the case if the firm faced a completely vertical residual demand. So one of the things that we've been doing a lot of over the last year is how do we get consumers to be more active participants, and the simplest way to describe it would be is how do we provide information to consumers about their electricity consumption, about how their electricity using actions translate into their electricity bill. We've done a number of experiments to try to figure out better ways to provide that information, the frequency to provide that information. Another is to design what you could call is, I would call politically acceptable dynamic pricing, since the one way to ensure that you're going to get thrown out of any commission is to come in and say, we should just pass through the hourly wholesale price and the retail price, that's it. So we've done a number of experiments looking at different ways to address this problem. One of the ways is the fact that, if you think that there's some cost of taking action or paying attention to the price that is going to cause you to actually want to go home and turn your lights out or do something, then, the example I would give is if I have like my demand, which is about, say an average of 2.5 kilowatts an hour, what's going to happen is, and if I only am going to do something if I save $5 and I can reduce my demand by 20%, these are all hypothetical numbers, then what it's going to take is essentially a $10,000 per megawatt hour price spike to cause me to actually go and do that. Well, what I can do is increase the duration of the high price period, and it becomes easier to amortize that fixed cost of taking action over more hours. That's the basic idea behind critical peak pricing, is it says I'm going to pre-commit to a certain number of hours in the day, and I'm going to pre-commit to the fact that you don't, that I'm only going to be able to declare these 10 hours a day, and that's one of the pricing plans we've looked at. Another is the so-called critical peak pricing with rebate, and here the way the rebate works is it's essentially the same thing. It's just that you get paid a rebate to reduce your demand below some administratively set level, and we'll pay you a refund equal to the difference between the administrative level and your actual consumption, assuming you get below that. Now, the nice thing about the rebate mechanism is it essentially hits the sweet spot for Americans, which is you can't lose. Every American likes something they can't lose on, and so. But it has this problem: is it only uses a carrot. It doesn't use a stick as well, and the stick being that you got to pay a high price if you don't respond, whereas under the rebate mechanism, if you don't respond, you just continue to pay according to the fixed price. And one of the interesting things that we investigate is this results in the so-called option to quit, kind of what I call option to quit, meaning that if it's a really hot day and they declare a critical peak event, if it's a rebate, you cannot respond and you still pay according to your old fixed price. But if it's a critical peak pricing, then you know that I'm going to pay that really high price for everything I consume. And so what we did in this experiment is we said, let's make it so the marginal price for the rebate and the marginal price for the critical peak price are the same, and let's see how much less price response you get from the rebate relative to the critical peak price, because of the fact that under the rebate, if I quit, then I don't get that rebate, but I continue to pay according to that fixed price. And what we find is essentially that there is a significant sort of option to quit effect, in the sense that for the people under the critical peak with rebate, we found that essentially their response to this critical peak event was roughly half the response of the critical peak price that said you're going to pay the high price for everything you consume versus you're only going to get the same marginal cost reduction for a given reduction in demand under the rebate. We found that because of this option, they had a significantly smaller. And then these are a number of the other questions we looked at. One of the big issues, just to sort of talk about, is the fact that a big thing we looked at was low-income consumers. In particular, we had a number of low-income customers in the study that we looked at. And a big concern with dynamic pricing is it going to harm low-income consumers? What we found was, for the most part, they were the ones that effectively gave us the largest demand reduction, got the greatest benefits in terms of bill savings relative to the richer customers. But these are the sorts of things to try to essentially, as you like, to get these dynamic pricing. So the last is, yeah.
What's the answer to the last bullet?
Oh, these definitely, the technology works great. So in the sense that this pretty much, for all of the pricing plans, the smart thermostats and the like pretty much significantly increase the size of the effect of declaring the event, largely because what you could do is you could program your thermostat to be responsive to the event, whereas if you didn't have a thermostat, you'd actually have to physically take action. So the technology is extremely useful. So we got if you like, an incremental effect for the customers that we assigned the thermostats to. So the last issue to just discuss is a big difficulty in these markets is that electricity is extremely complicated how it flows, and you can design a market that pretends that electricity doesn't flow according to Kirchhoff's laws and other sorts of things, but the challenge is going to be the fact that customers will exploit that fact. That, in other words, what they're going to do is they're going to say, hey, I know you're actually going to need to run my power plant, even though my power plant didn't win in your auction. So you ran an auction, as is typically the case, is you ran an auction that said, all right, so let's take the simplest example, is, as I said right here, is we're going to assume that the transmission network is a copper plate. We're going to run the auction for generators assuming that, and we're going to find that this generator wins in the auction, but when we actually go to see whether or not he can produce electricity, we find out the network won't let that happen. So then what we do is we go in and we say, okay, we'll pay you, supplier, a little bit more. We'll pay you, supplier, to go away. And what typically happens is suppliers quickly figure out that, yes, I'm going to be the guy that's going to need to operate. It really doesn't immediately matter what I bid in. And so, in other words, they start to take advantage of that fact. Well, and what this can do is raise the cost of supplying electricity. And so what happens is there's essentially what's called locational marginal pricing, where what you do is you effectively price all of the network constraints. What does this mean mathematically? It means that you say minimize, as I said right here, the ad bid cost to meet demand, subject to all the constraints. And you get prices potentially at all locations in the network. And what I did in some work is to look at the case of California actually switching, and what we did is looked at essentially how does that impact the cost of meeting load across, if you like, similar system conditions, similar levels of output, and under the old market versus the new market. And much to my surprise, we found roughly about a 2% reduction. You go, okay, 2%'s not much, but the nice thing about electricity is the law of sort of many repetitions applies, because 2% of the amount of electricity that's actually delivered through the California grid, the cost of doing that's about $105 million. So a significant amount of benefits in terms of the cost of meeting load, as well as in terms of the amount of BTUs, or if you like, the amount of greenhouse gases, because if what we managed to do was supply the same amount of energy and use less fossil fuels, that's also going to have less greenhouse gases as well. So the big thing is just suppliers had less of an incentive to take advantage of this divergence between the physical reality of the network and the financial market they used to operate it. So just to finish up, is you know, the nice thing here is economics, in terms of thinking about this issue of designing these markets, it really is the, if you like, an ideal environment to think through how it is that we're actually going to make this restructured market actually deliver the benefits that we think that it ultimately can do. And the big thing here is going to mean is how do we make, to put it in the language that I introduced, how do we make each of these guys perceive that they face a substantial amount of competition? So what they're going to want to do is offer in at offer curves that are very close to their cost, their minimum cost of production, which is then going to yield market outcomes that are going to come very close to what we would like to see as the ideal. And you know, this is effectively what a lot of the research in the economics of electricity markets is about, is essentially how do we make sure that these technologies, that this change in incentives is going to actually produce a cheaper electricity at the same level of reliability to consumers that we essentially thought it would be the case. And these just give you an idea of the sorts of things that you know, I gave you some idea of the sorts of things you could look at to try to achieve that. And in terms of other things that we're sort of working on, is the next step is this really taking seriously intermittency, because it is going to make this problem even more complex, as well as the other is carbon markets and emissions markets. And this is just a cautionary tale. California recently implemented AB 32, which is a cap and trade market. And during the crisis period, the interactions between the emissions permit markets for nitrous oxide permits essentially created a significant problem. So I'm currently a member of the Market Advisory Committee for the California's greenhouse gas market, and the idea here now is to make sure that what happened here with emissions permits doesn't happen here with carbon permits, or else California will likely do what it did for electricity restructuring for carbon markets, and we certainly don't want that. So I will stop right here and essentially give a shameless plug to my website for anybody interested. Okay, Frank, you're going to take some questions. Anybody have any questions? Over there.
So have you modeled the PJM market? Has any of the regulation to help enhance competition?
Yes, I mean, PJM is very similar. It's similar market design, has very similar problems. Yeah, I mean, the difference is just that PJM's data is confidential. I have access to much of the data from California as a result of the work I've done in California, but you know, that's the big reason to look in California. But it's.
Consider PJM similar to California?
Excuse me?
You would consider the PJM market design similar to California?
Yeah, they're both LNP markets. So.
One has no capacity, one has capacity.
Yeah, but capacity is like tenure. Does it really affect your behavior at the margin? So basically, capacity markets is kind of like, I mean, it's not going to affect sort of short-term market operation. It's much more just about you're going to get the steady revenue stream from the existence of this capacity payment. But for the most part, how the short-term markets operate, they're very, very, very similar. Capacity markets are a whole nother issue, but yeah. But like I said, I think the analogy to tenure is very good. So, Rob?
Yeah. Is there any game theory to this subject where people bluff and do things of that sort? And is there room for that in your framing?
I mean, most of this stuff is, I mean, we're just looking at pretty high levels of strategic interaction in the sense of, okay, I know that I face, you know, so for example, I know that I face favorable market conditions. How am I going to respond? in terms of bluffing and all that sort of stuff, that's kind of what traders do. Traders are inveterate gossips, and but economists aren't real good at sort of modeling gossip.
Let me ask the question: does this market in fact have elements of bluffing and that you're not including in the present formulation?
Perhaps
from
I mean,
empirically, do we know that? Is that a small or a large part of what goes? Empirically, it's sort of like a question of whether. I mean, there are other markets where you write it down one way, and then in fact it's running a different way.
That's, I think, the nice thing about these markets is essentially, as I said right here, is I mean, that's the thing that's very nice about electricity markets is essentially the market rules are written down in the tariff. So essentially, you know exactly how that guy's getting paid. You know exactly what actions he can take to influence the market price. And so in that sense, it's very different from much of economics where we say, well, I'm going to assume
I know.
set quantity. Here, you're going to say, well, I know firms set 10 bid prices, 10 bid quantities for their output. I know that essentially we determine the price through solving this locational marginal price. I mean, you literally can replicate the actual market outcome by just using the things that are in the tariff. So, that's the thing that makes these markets very, very useful relative to, say, if I'm going to model, say, the automobile market, I probably would have to assume some model of competition that I don't know is exactly true. Here, it's essentially, the way I would describe it is to economists is it's kind of like experimental economics on steroids, because effectively the market rules are well designed. Who knows what is well designed, even stuff that economists worry about, like, for example, off equilibrium play. So, for example, a big thing that economists worry about is what's called a concept called subgame perfection. In other words, what are we going to do off the equilibrium path? Well, that actually gets specified in the market rules. So you can even go through and sort of say, okay, knowing that this is what's going to happen, and so the nice thing is you really can take the full power of game theory to these kinds of environments because they are so clearly specified.
And what happened with Enron in California? Where does that fit into a model of this kind?
The best thing I could say about Enron is that if you're taking people's money, don't be a jerk. Enron had very little to do with California, almost nothing. For the most part, what Enron did was nothing different from what everybody else did. It's just that they did it far more nastily. So, I mean,
what I'm trying to get at is where might the model fail? Because there's behavior that's allowed, or once was allowed and isn't allowed anymore, whatever it is that makes this not capture the full story.
For the most part, like I said, most of what Enron did is still allowed. It's more that I mean, I would say that this is not going to capture, if you like, we're not trying to get it down to 6 significant digits. It would be the way that I describe it, is that we're trying to get it down to the first or second significant digit, and I think that's where what we're getting at. So for example, the microeconomics of, okay, do I do this, do I do that? We're simply trying to understand sort of how can I enhance the performance of this market by the fact of the tools that I as a market designer have. So there's many reasons why you would not think that this is an exact description, but I think it gets at many of the forces that actually exist and helps to so yeah, I wouldn't push it too far. It's a model.
Second. What I can see, what you're doing allows a producer to operate closer to capacity, right? It's the capacity can be used more efficiently or more profitable that way. But what did it do for the consumer? It's hard to tickle this out, but is electricity the same price as before this partial deregulation, or is it lower, or is it higher?
That is the $100 billion question. And the simplest way that I could describe it to you in terms of certainly my research as well as the research of a number of others is certainly the cost of meeting demand is lower. What's debatable is the price to consumers lower? And therein lies, so for example, there's pretty good evidence, as you can see, that from the using LNP, we've in some sense squeezed out some of the inefficiencies in the dispatch. The other is from the fact that producers now, if you like, get to keep what they kill in the sense of if my generator, if I can get my cost down, I keep all the money. There's good evidence to suggest that generators are operated more efficiently, meaning that they're, if you like, their sort of average cost of operation has declined for the generators. The other is that there's another paper looking at the fact of opening up the market to a formal market allows more trade to take place by low-cost power displacing high-cost power. That's a source of benefits. But all those things are on the fact of the cost of serving demand. The question is have those gotten passed through to consumers? The big problem there is the layer of regulation that essentially regulators aren't exactly interested in, number one, passing on benefits to consumers purely in terms of prices. They've got other things they're thinking of. The other is the fact that this issue of market power, where the price that gets charged in the wholesale market may not fully reflect that cost reduction because suppliers can put a margin between their price and that cost. So that would be my best guess of what the sort of the state of the world is that certainly restructuring has benefited producers, whether or not it's really passed on to producers. These are the sorts of areas, and that's really what I'm interested in, is to say, okay, we have to revisit how we plan transmission because of the sorts of issues we discussed. We have to revisit how we price electricity consumers because that's going to help. All of those factors are going to help to sort of pass more of those benefits on to consumers. That's the basic idea. But as I said, the evidence is pretty good on the producer side in terms of squeezing out the inefficiencies.
We can take one more question if there is one. Here we go.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk more about the forward contracts and like what's the average length and what factors go into choosing like how long and how much energy is provided to the customer?
Oh, remember, this is a generator selling to a retailer.
Okay.
So what happens is that, so think of it as the simplest way is all right, I'm a here, let me go back. But the idea is typically what this becomes is just a way for if you've ever seen electricity prices, they are for the most part massively volatile relative to any price you've ever seen, largely because to give you a good example, it's certainly in the real-time market it could be anything as low as minus $300. Yes, that means you're getting paid to consume electricity, to as high as say plus $5,000 all within a day. And so what the contracts do is essentially mitigate that price risk to the supplier. How you choose to hedge your risk, there's all sorts of products that you can buy. So there are like things like the analogous to a stock option. You can buy a cap contract where you say, look, you'll pay me essentially price spike insurance. There's floor contracts. There's all sorts of things. And it's all about, you're designing essentially a risk management portfolio for this generator. And but the interesting thing is that in a market where suppliers have the ability to move the price, the interesting thing that happens is that forward contract also changes my incentive to move that price. And the analogy would be is buying a stock option from Bill Gates. If you bought a call option from Bill Gates on Microsoft, you probably didn't make a very wise decision because Bill can determine the price of that call option. But the nice thing is that but if you said buy a call option from Bill Gates at 50 when the price is 45, you can be pretty confident it's not going to get above 50. And same thing here is that's sort of one of the things you want to take advantage of. And the other way to think about it is with forward contracts is everybody knows the price is going to spike. They just know when. They don't know when. By buying the contract, you're essentially hedging against that risk and then making sure that doesn't happen. So it takes on a different role in a market where suppliers have the ability to influence prices.
There's one chief in the back. Let's thank our speaker.